Good morning, everyone. This is uh, this is now Unit 6. Okay, the prelude to Unit 6. We're going to be talking about that. So I guess we would call this Chapter 51 and a half. Okay, and we will be getting into the 20th century modernism according to this. If you look on page 310 in your book, you can see a timeline that explains a lot of things that were going on during this time. And if you recall, I mentioned to you earlier that music is just a reflection of society, it's a mirror of society. And I think that this is an important concept to keep in mind because you're going to hear things that you've never heard before. Dissonances, clashes, really a complex rhythms. I mean, you name it, it's going to be thrown at you starting in the 20th century. And there's a lot of people out there that get kind of confused with it, and they also get kind of upset with it because basically tonality is thrown out the window for quite a few composers. And many people wonder, like, what in the world was going on here? Why in the world would composers become so radical about their about music and not make it sound beautiful or anything like that? And one of the reasons is because of what's going on during the 20th century. We don't forget we had two massive world wars that took place, plus numerous other conflicts that happened all over the place. Keep in mind that that communication increased in speed like nothing had ever happened before. I mean, it was unreal, all the changes that took place in the 20th century. And that's the reason why you need to be aware of of all of these new modern things that started to take place and why music is going to react in the way it ends up reacting. Now, if you look on page 312, it says making music modern. And there's a statement by a wonderful composer, an American composer named Aaron Copland. Also, if you can recall, I mentioned to the fact that the musical world is starting to shift. Also, it's starting to leave Europe and it's starting to come to the Americas, especially to the United States. And Aaron Copland is one of our super great composers that came out of this country. And he writes here, the entire history of modern music may be said to be a history of the gradual pull away from the German musical tradition of the past century, which is exactly what it was. Okay, Germany was beginning to be kind of pushed to the side by many different nations. We especially found that to be true in that last chapter when we were listening to uh, Claude Debussy, okay? And we listened to his music, L'après-midi du Faun, the afternoon of a faun. And in that particular work, that's the signs of Impressionism. It's part of the French reaction against German Romanticism, okay? So keep this in mind when you're reading through the book. They talk about early modernist art on page 313. And they talk about some real key things to be aware of. They say, for instance, in the years surrounding the war, two influential art movements arose. An art movement called Futurism, whose manifesto of 1909 declared an alienation from established institutions and a focus on the dynamism of 20th century life. Hence, remember that thing about art being a reflection, music being a reflection of the society. All the arts are a reflection of of the society. So you can see this right in that statement about futurism. Uh, and then there's this other one called Dadaism. Dadaism founded in Switzerland in 1916. The Dadaists, mainly writers and artists who reacted to the horrors of the war bloodbath, rejected the concept of art as something to be reverently admired. To make their point, they produced works of absolute absurdity. They also reacted against the excessive complexity of Western art by trying to recapture the simplicity of the child's worldview. Following their example, the French composer Eric Satie, who we'll talk about a little bit later, wrote music in a simple everyday style. Okay, then they also mentioned here about a couple of other things to be aware of. The Dada group, with artists like Marcel Duchamp, merged into the school of surrealism, which included Salvador Dali and uh, and Joan Miro, both of whom explored the world of dreams. Other styles of modern art included Cubism, the Paris-based style of painting in geometric patterns embodied in the works of course, the one and only Pablo Picasso, Georges Braque, and Jean Gris, and Expressionism, which made a significant impact on music of the early 20th century, as we will see in chapter 52. The new styles in both art and music that flourished after the war are often referred to as avant-garde, okay? A French term originally used to describe the part of an army that charged first into battle. Artists who identify as avant-garde distinguish themselves from traditional high culture and from mass market taste, seeking to explore true creativity by breaking from social and artistic conventions, sometimes quite radically. Okay, now they mention also at the bottom of page 313 musical markets in the United States. They bring out here, for example, they say throughout the United States, minstrel shows, which we saw back in chapter 38, expanded into the tradition of vaudeville, which combined all kinds of comedic, theatrical, and musical arts, many written by immigrant composers and often satirizing new immigrants in ways similar to the portrayal of African Americans in minstrelsies. New York City, especially the thoroughfare called Broadway, became the most vibrant center for vaudeville, and by the turn of the 20th century, it was the most prolific center of music publishing as well. The popular music written in the following decades, along with its writers and publishers, is known as Tin Pan Alley, for the street in Manhattan where publishers had their business. Okay, so please be aware of the fact that, wow, things are starting to really take off in America at this time. They mention here on page 314, between two wars, music and the Great Depression. Okay, keep in mind, the Great Depression occurred, and it wasn't something that was real mild. We have never, ever in our lifetimes experienced anything even remotely like what happened with the Great Depression. Okay, and so again, music is going to react to a lot of that sort of thing too. Features of early musical modernism. And there's a little statement here that I want to read because it comes from one of the most important people of the 20th century, a lady named Nadia Boulanger. Okay, to study music, we must learn the rules. To create music, we must break them. Okay, and that was pretty much the standard, ladies and gentlemen, of 20th century music. Okay, it was basically to do everything you could to break every rule that had ever been established in music. All right, and they mention here the new rhythmic complexity. Here's a whole bunch of crazy things going on. They mention here now the metrical flow shifted constantly. That is, we didn't have a constantly same beat pattern that was working throughout the entire piece of music. We would have changing meters. Okay, sometimes changing as fast as with each measure. Okay, we'll run into that when we start talking about a guy named Igor Stravinsky. Formerly, one rhythmic pattern was used at a time. Now composers turn to what we call polyrhythm. Poly meaning many, so many rhythms, the simultaneous use of several rhythmic patterns. As a result of these innovations, Western music achieved something of the complexity and subtleness of Asian and African rhythms. This revitalization of rhythm is one of the major achievements of early 20th century music. Now, one thing I want to keep in mind too, we haven't talked much about African music because once again, this class's music appreciation is dealing with Western music history and all. But I can tell you this, there is no rhythmic pattern that has ever been invented in the West that even comes close to some of the things that happened in Africa. Okay, the African rhythms there are so unbelievably complex that we have people that we can't even figure it out. It's so unbelievably complex. But we did try to copy it a great deal. So 20th century music in the Western sense is really starting to take in some of these concepts. The new melody and harmony on page 316. And of course, if we have a thing called polyrhythm, many rhythms, then what's wrong with the idea of having polyharmony? Okay, that is more than one harmonic tonal center going on at the same time. Sometimes we would have two of them, that would be called bitonality. Three of them, tritonality. And sometimes we actually went so far away, and they mentioned this in the bottom of that paragraph, that we end up going to a thing called atonality. Okay, atonality means no tonal center. Okay, everything is completely gone. All right, and that's going to become very important. It's going to lead to such things as a thing called serialism or the 12-tone composition. And we won't see that until we get into chapter 55. But believe me, it gets pretty amazing what they end up doing. Now, orchestration, they do mention here, first off, that the rich sonorities of the 19th century orchestration gave way to a leaner, brighter sound played by a smaller orchestra. Now, you may be asking, okay, why exactly would we, we've been doing nothing but getting larger and larger and larger. Why in the world are we going to suddenly start cutting back and getting to small groups? Well, the simplest answer is World War I. Because during World War I, so many men were drafted into their armies and stuff that there wasn't any, there were very few musicians left. So many composers had to actually start writing music for the smaller number of people that were available to perform it. Hence, we end up with some very, very small groups. One of the most famous pieces by a composer named Igor Stravinsky, I've mentioned that name already, is a piece called L'Histoire de Soldat, okay, which means a soldier's tale, all right? And this work encompasses 7 musicians. That's it. You have a violin playing the high string parts. You have a string bass playing the low string parts. Okay, so there's your string section right there. 1 violin, 1 string bass. Then you have a clarinet. I'm trying to remember exactly what we have. A clarinet and a bassoon. The clarinet plays all the high woodwind stuff. The bassoon takes care of the low woodwind stuff. Then you have a trumpet and a trombone. Okay, that's our brass section. High trumpet, low trombone. Okay, and then we have 1 percussionist that plays a whole slew of different percussion instruments. And therefore, we got our percussion section. So we actually have a full orchestra, but it's done in its barest form, in its skeletal form. Okay, so keep that in mind about this change in the way these things are going to happen. Then they mention at the very end, performance matters, modernist gestures. As modernist composers pushed the boundaries of harmony, timbre, and form, they also provided increasingly specific instructions to performers to ensure that their modern vision would be accurately conveyed. Okay, metronome markings and other interpretive and technical instructions, which had become increasingly common during the 19th century, became an essential component of composers' instructions on musical scores. Now, if you can recall back in the much earlier days, it was expected that the musicians would improvise. Okay, they would make up things and stuff and make it as colorful as they could possibly do, especially during the Baroque era. Well, by the time we start getting into the classical and romantic, the composers started to take more and more control over the way things are going to be performed. By the time we get in the 20th century, you don't have any choice. You have to do it exactly the way the composer wants it, otherwise it ain't going to work. Okay, so that's one of the things you also need to keep in mind. This high level of control that the composers are going to have in the music. Now, what will be interesting is that actually in the later 20th century, we will run into composers that are actually going to say, nah, let's go ahead and let the musician do whatever the hell they feel like doing. Okay, and sure enough, there will be a lot of that coming around too. Okay, because remember, they want to break every single rule in the book that they can. And that was another one, because for the longest time, 20th century composers were just writing things with such strict control. Okay, and finally, some composers just said, nah, the heck with it. I'm going to go ahead and let the musicians do whatever the heck they feel like to. Okay, so be prepared for all of this, because there's going to be some pretty big dramatic changes that are going to take place. I will see you in the next chapter. This will be chapter 52, and it says anything goes, Schoenberg and musical expressionism. And Expressionism is going to be one of the most powerful musical forces of all time. Again, interestingly enough, this actually comes out of Germany. Okay, Germany is going to still be a driving force. It isn't like as soon as the 20th century happened, everything moved over to the United States. No, Germany is still a very powerful moving force during this time. And Schoenberg is going to be one of those composers that's going to just turn the world completely upside down. So with that, I shall see all of you in the next chapter. Study hard, listen hard.